Good afternoon. I'd like to start today's session by welcoming everyone and thanking you for your attendance at today's webinar on home hybrid working and domestic abuse tips for employers, which will hopefully be an informative and interactive session today. So now I want to just lead on to introduce the topic and our speakers, and it leads us on to the reason we're here, which is to discuss home hybrid working and domestic abuse tips for employers. I'm Gary Sturrock and I'm one of the associates within the family law team at Brodie's LLP. Domestic abuse and its correlation with home and hybrid working, by which we mean an employee working both at home and in a workplace, is a very topical issue for employers. Indeed, it is a matter that employers will likely require to consider now more than ever, and it's something which employers will undoubtedly continue to have to think about into the future. Again, this will be covered a little bit later, but home and hybrid working isn't a new phenomenon, and the conditions that have been imposed by the government in 2020 in response to the outbreak of coronavirus did lead to a significant number of employees requiring to work from home, often in many cases for the first time. In some cases, employers have observed the benefits of home and hybrid working for employees, and also in terms of business productivity and cost savings. The current message from the Scottish Government on their website continues to be that home hybrid working now is encouraged, and employers are encouraged to facilitate, in their words, hybrid and flexible working. They say that it has many benefits which go beyond the need to control COVID-19, for example, supporting businesses and organisations' sustainable operations. Working from home some or all of the time has, in our experience though, presented some unique challenges for many. For some, there's been a link between the increased time spent at home and exposure to domestic abuse in the family home. As a family lawyer, I've been acutely aware over the last 2 years of the impact of mandatory home working on individuals and families. From my experience, it's led to strains in marriages and relationships, and in some cases it's led to situations where clients have experienced domestic abuse, which has many forms. We'll be hearing more about that in a short while from one of my colleagues. As a family lawyer, we often deal with matters at a crisis point, and we've been required to assist clients with many issues arising from domestic abuse over the last couple of years, including seeking protective orders. But thinking then to today's presentation, do employers have some role to play in assisting colleagues who may be experiencing domestic abuse? And what could be done to try and prevent things escalating and reaching that crisis point? We're going to be hearing today from two speakers, Lynne Marr, who's a partner in our employment team at Brodie's LLP, and Abby Bisset from Shetland Women's Aid. Our first speaker today is Lynne Marr. Lynne is an accredited specialist, accredited by the Law Society of Scotland as a specialist in employment law, and she's also an accredited mediator. Lynne works with clients in various fields across the public and private sector in the UK. Lynne advises on all stages of the employment relationship, and she has a particular interest in advising on complex HR issues. I'm now going to pass you over to Lynne, who's going to talk to us about the employment law aspects of today's topic.
Okay, thanks very much, Gary, for that nice introduction, all my specialisms. As Gary said, I've specialised in employment law for a long time, over 20 years, and I'm predominantly involved in advising employers. So I do regularly work with HR professionals, and I know that in their day-to-day work, and some of you indeed might be on the call today, will have to try and deal with the sensitive subject of a situation perhaps where you suspect that an employee is the victim of domestic abuse. And you have to try and work out how to support that individual in the workplace. But I have to say that it hasn't really featured as a significant issue in the context of employee grievances or employment tribunal complaints, for example, in my work or in the work, I think, of my colleagues. But that was really until the pandemic hit, because I remember quite early on during the pandemic being contacted by a client, and we were obviously all in the midst of helping clients to respond to the pandemic, getting people home, getting them to work safely from home, getting them to continue working in the workplace. So not even hybrid working, just getting them to work at home. And this particular client contacted me to ask how they might respond to a trade union colleague that had been in touch with them to say, you have to stop all this getting people to work at home. We know there's a pandemic, but you have to create safe spaces for people who need access to the workplace. Those people being people that were suffering from addiction issues, which is one issue, but the other being domestic violence. And that kind of really brought it home to me that this was a significant issue, and one that hadn't really been at the top of my priority list or thinking. As I say, we were advising clients on furlough and just getting people to continue working from home, and things like redundancies and varying terms and conditions and all those sorts of things that employment lawyers were doing at that time. But since that initial question came up, it's something which does appear to be recurring as a bit of a theme, more so than it ever has before. And I think that must inevitably be because of the correlation that Gary mentioned between the pandemic and people beginning to work from home, whether that is a kind of remote first situation where people are working wholly from home, or indeed where they might be working partly in a physical workplace, or working from home as well. And obviously, whenever somebody is the victim of or the target of domestic abuse, then there is going to likely be an impact on the workplace or their work, because it's going to be very common that their conduct might be impacted, but more likely things like their performance at work will be impacted, or indeed their attendance at work will be impacted. And that can result obviously in the employer itself then being drawn into or engaged in various interventions which can take up management time. So in short, there is going to be an overall impact or negative impact on productivity. And the abuse obviously is not always taking place at home either. I know we're talking today about hybrid working and the increase in prevalence of domestic abuse and the impact at home, but it can spill into the workplace as well. So it's important to think about that. So people that are the perpetrators of domestic abuse will often contact the victims when they're actually at work. They might present themselves physically in the workplace, and that can start to draw in colleagues as well, which can put them at risk or take up time on their part as well. So it is a significant issue, both I think in the physical workplace, but obviously at the moment more so with hybrid working and home working. So I suppose the question as a lawyer is, what can the liability of an employer be where there is domestic abuse? What sort of legal obligations and therefore risk can you be exposed to? So I'm just going to talk about some of the legal obligations and risks that you might be exposed to. There is no specific legislation in the UK that places obligations on employers to address domestic abuse in the workplace. However, there are quite a number of different existing legal provisions which will bite here and which could have an impact or that you might want to be thinking about. And the first and most obvious one, obviously in this particular context that we're talking about today, is the employer's duty, so far as it's reasonably practicable, to ensure the health and safety and well-being of all its employees in the workplace, to make sure that they're not exposed to any unnecessary risks, either to their physical health, but also to their mental health. And those obligations come from two key sources. The first is the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, and also various related regulations. There's lots of regulations under the Health and Safety at Work Act, and also just the common law obligations. So in terms of the employment law contract, there is an implied obligation on the part of the employer to make sure that employees are provided with a safe working environment. And that is to make sure that there's an environment which is free from discrimination, but also free from violence, whether that be verbal abuse or any kind of physical abuse. And certainly the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999 require employers to carry out a health and safety risk assessment. So that is to make an assessment of all the health and safety risks that might be present in the workplace. And the purpose of those assessments, and I'm not a health and safety expert, I should emphasise, is to identify any potential hazards in the workplace, assess the risk of harm, and then take whatever steps are necessary to either eliminate or control or mitigate the risks in the workplace if they can't be eliminated altogether. Now that obligation, you can see how that would clearly arise in a physical workplace, but the regulations don't just extend to where there is a physical workplace. They will extend to a working environment, which is the home. So if people are working at home, your health and safety risk assessments should cover home working environments. And I know that's something, there was lots of risk assessments done of COVID risks, but it's important for employers to be thinking about this, particularly now that we're really past all the transitioning phase. We're moving into hybrid and home working on a much more permanent basis. So employers really do need to be thinking about the health and safety risks associated with that. And if there is a known risk of domestic abuse, it's something you are aware of or ought reasonably to be aware of, then there is a chance that home working, as Gary alluded to, and I think Abby might touch on as well, is that home working might exacerbate that risk. The abuse might escalate. And so if that risk is known, your health and safety risk assessment should take that into account. And you probably will want some advice on what steps might be taken to try and mitigate against those risks. Now, the risks are known, and there hasn't been an assessment of the risk, and an injury occurs, then you are potentially exposed to the risk of a personal injury claim as well. So be mindful of that. More squarely, I suppose, in the field of employment law, I mentioned the impact on employees in terms of their conduct or their performance or their attendance at work. If they're the subject of domestic abuse, that's likely to be adversely impacted. And whenever that's the case, employers obviously have formal procedures in place to deal with that. And those procedures inevitably will go through warning stages, but can ultimately lead to dismissal. And if an employee is dismissed because of underperformance, for example, then an employer is going to have to be able to demonstrate, if they dismiss them, that at the point at which they dismiss them, that was a sufficient reason for dismissal in all the circumstances of the case, having carried out a fair and reasonable performance management procedure. Now, part of that procedure is going to likely include exploring what the reasons are for the underperformance. And if some of the underlying reasons include the fact that the person has been the subject of domestic abuse, and that has been either known or ought reasonably to have been known and is ignored or not taken into account, then there is at least the risk that will materialise into an unfair dismissal complaint, which of course can expose you to financial penalties in the employment tribunal in the sense of compensatory awards and basic awards up to the tune of £93,000+, or at least a year's gross pay. So something that you would want to mitigate against or eliminate the risk of that happening if you possibly can. And in the same vein, I'm sure a lot of you have come across the concept of constructive unfair dismissal. If you are aware that an employee is suffering from domestic abuse or has been subject to that, and no steps at all are taken to support it, or indeed the employee feels that any concerns that they've raised or attempts to get support have been ignored, then there's also a risk that they might treat that as a breach of the implied term of trust and confidence and resign, and bring a claim of constructive unfair dismissal as well. And those are, I suppose, leaving aside the risks of discrimination. So we also know that those who are the subject of domestic abuse are very likely to suffer not just physical injuries or physical impairments, if you like, but they might also suffer from mental impairments such as anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. And in the workplace, then that could potentially mean that they are suffering from a condition which has a long-term impact on their day-to-day activities, and it could mean that they are disabled for the purposes of the Equality Act and provisions under the Equality Act. And so it might be necessary then for the employer to consider whether or not it has to make reasonable adjustments, for example, to performance improvement processes or attendance processes to support that particular employee and to avoid or minimise the risk of discrimination complaints. Still on the theme of discrimination, it is entirely possible that where you have a perpetrator and a victim of domestic abuse, they will be co-workers. So they're working in the same workplace, whether that's in a physical workplace or at home. And so you also run the risk potentially of sex discrimination, sexual harassment claims arising. And indeed, we've also seen more recently a rise in the engagement of the Protection from Harassment Act, which are complaints that can be brought in the sheriff courts or the county courts in England. And you might be more familiar with this being referred to as the stalking legislation. So there is the risk of that as well. So that's all for us. All very well in terms of the sort of legislation that might bite or might be engaged. And there is obviously a very good legal and commercial reasons to try and address domestic abuse to mitigate against those risks arising. But of course, compliance isn't everything. I think a lot of employers would agree that actually addressing domestic abuse in the workplace, whether that's in a physical workplace or as people are moving to work at home, they also have a moral obligation and they want to be good employers. It's good employment practice to take steps to try and address these issues. So what sort of things can an employer, or what should an employer be reasonably doing to address these sorts of issues? I suppose an overarching thing to do is to create a formal domestic abuse strategy. And of course, that could have many strands to it. And I've got some bullet points there on the slide, which you can see. It's by no means exhaustive. Some of you may have other things that you would add to that list. I guess having a policy is always a good starting point. And of course, a policy is probably going to set out exactly what you regard or how you define domestic abuse, why it's a workplace issue, what you want to set out as well, how an employee might go about actually raising domestic abuse if they are the victim of it. They'll be concerned about confidentiality and they'll have all sorts of concerns, I'm sure. So you want to be able to set out in the policy who they should go to and how they can go about doing that. And then I suppose importantly also what sort of support an employee who is the victim of domestic abuse might expect to get from the employer if they do raise it. A policy might also include other things like signposting employees to resources that they might be able to access. And also, I think really importantly, a policy will also want to set out how an employer will deal with people in the workplace who are perpetrators of domestic abuse. They'll probably want to cross-reference their disciplinary policies. But I guess before even drafting the policy, if you are going to offer support, you're going to have to think about what sort of support you are going to be able to offer to employees who are victims of domestic abuse. So for example, you might want to have a think about whether you're going to be able to offer them things like counselling, whether you might be able to offer them paid time off from work, and that might be to go and look for accommodation, take your children, put them into other schools. They might need time off for things like that. Are you able to support that for them? Are you able to give them advances of loans if they're subject to some sort of economic type control? Can you do that to support them? So useful to think about what it is you can actually do. It's quite an interesting thing. I don't know if any of you spotted this, but in Northern Ireland, a bill has been introduced called the Domestic Abuse Safe Leave Bill, which aims to do exactly that, to give people a day one right in their employment to up to 10 days paid leave a year, to allow them to go away and make, I suppose, various arrangements if they are the subject of abuse, to do things like take legal advice or to go and look for alternative accommodation, that sort of thing. I think the other thing that employers can do is think about working with specialist agencies. We're going to hear from Abby as well today, because that will help to raise awareness in the organisation of the sorts of support available, and considering networks with other employers so that you can share experience, and that might give you ideas as well about how you might be able to address issues practically in the workplace. So those are some ideas, as I say, not exhaustive, and I'm sure actually Abby might refer to some more of them. So I will pass back to Gary. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention, which the slides just popped up, which is access to our workbox domestic abuse and gender-based violence page. Some of you may already be subscribers to Workbox. For those of you who are not, we are opening up the domestic abuse and gender-based violence page as a free access page until the 12th of May. So please do take a look at that. There's lots of information on there covering some of the issues that I've just talked about. And if anyone would like to get in touch to talk about access to Workbox more generally, then do please just get in touch with me or your usual Brodie's contact. And with that, I will hand back to Gary.
Thank you very much, Lynne. Before I move on to introduce our second speaker, I just want to give a wee reminder to attendees that questions can be submitted throughout the session using the Q&A function. You'll find the box at the bottom of your screen to submit a question to us privately, and we will cover those questions at the end. So I'm very pleased to introduce our second speaker, who is Abby Bisset. Abby is a Prevention Education Coordinator at Shetland Women's Aid. Abby's role involves spreading awareness of domestic abuse and coercive control with the aim of prevention. She organises workshops for schools and other agencies. Women's Aid generally are, as many know, an organisation who assist women and children who have experienced or been exposed to domestic abuse. Given their significant experience at the coalface, they are in an excellent position to talk about the real experiences and the lived experiences of those who have faced domestic abuse, as opposed to just the black letter law and policies. Women's Aid are able to provide us with helpful information, particularly for employers, about spotting signs that an employee is potentially experiencing domestic abuse, and give us some really helpful tips about how we go about that, and how we go about having conversations about domestic abuse. They can also tell us about experiences of individuals that they've worked with, and the impact that they have had in relation to home working and their exposure to domestic abuse. So on that note, I'm going to now pass you over to Abby Bisset of Scottish Women's Aid.
Yes, thank you, Gary, for that introduction, and thank you, Lynne, for those really fascinating slides. So yeah, I'm just here to give you kind of a general overview of domestic abuse and the impact of lockdown, home working, hybrid working on women and children who have experienced domestic abuse. So this slide here, I'm sure this is kind of common knowledge to you all, but it's good to remind ourselves what domestic abuse is and how widespread it is. So the Scottish Government defines domestic abuse as controlling, coercive, threatening, abusive, degrading and/or violent behaviours, including sexual violence perpetrated by a partner or ex-partner. So all forms of domestic abuse are against the law, and the Domestic Abuse Scotland Act 2018 also criminalised coercive control. And what we found, especially in our agency, is that coercive control is probably the most common form of domestic abuse, but it's also sadly the one that's understood the least. And that's about, exerting total control over someone else and making them dependent on you to kind of survive and go about their day. So how widespread is domestic abuse? 1 in 4 women in the UK will experience domestic abuse, and the police recorded a 4% increase in domestic abuse incidences from 2019 to 2020, to 2020 to 2021, and lockdown and home working inevitably played a role in this. Domestic abuse, she's gone, is a gendered crime, and 88% of domestic abuse cases have a female victim and a male perpetrator. So throughout these slides, we're going to be referring to this as being a male on female crime, but that's not to say that domestic abuse doesn't happen to men, and of course it happens in same-sex relationships as well, and that comes with its own kind of issues. So now you can go on to the next slide. Brilliant. So I just thought I would run through some statistics here. I won't go through all of them, as you can read them and look back, but it's just to show the increase in domestic abuse and lockdown and what home working has on this. So the domestic abuse charity Refuge reported a 61% increase in helpline contacts compared to their pre-pandemic baseline. Similarly, Women's Aid reported a 41% increase in users using their live chat service. And in a study that was published in November last year, Women's Aid found that of 90% of their survey respondents who fed into that piece of work said that the COVID-19 pandemic had affected their experience in at least one way, while 67% said that the virus itself had been used as part of the abuse they suffered in more than one ways. And if we go over to the next slide, we can explore what tactics were used, these new kind of ways of manipulation and control. So I'm sure, again, it comes as no surprise that lockdown had a significant impact. Lockdown really created the ideal environment for isolation and other controlling behaviours to take place. So this includes things such as increasing their control of women's movement. We were physically not allowed to go outside, and if women did start to go outside, it was, well, where are you going? Who are you with? Keeping women isolated, not only physically isolated in our own home, but socially too. If someone's not allowed to have access to their phone, to their social media, to stay in touch with these people, then I mean you are left completely isolated, especially during the first lockdown. Threatening to expose women and their children to the virus, and kind of adding on to that, and something that we saw quite a lot was that if you go to Tesco's, or as things start opening up, or if you go to the pub, or if you go and meet your pals, what if you catch COVID and you bring it back and you kill me and the kids? So this guilt trip manipulation to try and keep control of women in the house. And I mean, less so now, but during the first lockdown, we saw a lot of women getting discouraged from seeking help being told that services were not operating, or that the police, wouldn't respond. They've got greater things to deal with. Or if you go to the police and you tell them that you've broken COVID lockdown, then you'll be arrested and the kids will be taken away, which we know to be untrue. But if you are in this kind of manipulated state, it's very easy to see how someone might believe that. So I think the last 2 points are particularly important here. So as the last of the lockdown measures are lifted and we reach the end of the UK's exit strategy, then the isolation and the familial control that abusers once had in the home may be starting to loosen, might be starting to dissipate. And this is extremely dangerous to women in abusive situations. Loss of control is the greatest trigger in why abusers murder their partners and ex-partners. It's this mindset, well, if I can't have you, then no one can. And sadly, that ends with the loss of life. So you can go on to the next slide there. So I've just taken an excerpt here out of that Women's Aid study that I mentioned before, and this is talking about, this is a young person who used their live chat to submit this. It says, I really need your help. My dad has been physically abusing my mum. He has an anger problem and it's getting out of hand. The smallest things make him angry and he starts shouting. I'm terrified of him and I've had enough. I can't take it anymore. Please help me. So that excerpt there kind of highlights the impact that domestic abuse can also have on children. And if we think again about the movement out of this exit strategy, a lot of children have been are now being homeschooled because it suits families a lot better. Parents might think it's a better option. However, we do have to kind of look at these situations a bit more as well. So you could move on to that next slide. Brilliant. So domestic abuse, lockdown, hybrid working, home working, it all had an impact on people's employment. And as you can see from the first point here, then restricting access to employment was a key feature of economic abuse during lockdown, with just under half of the women surveyed by a charity called Surviving Economic Abuse stating that their employment had either significantly or slightly worsened since the start of the outbreak as a result of the perpetrator's actions. So how has this home working, hybrid working, engagement with work been impacted for those who have been experiencing domestic abuse? An abuser's methods might include sabotaging someone's ability to work. So as you'll see in the next slide in a moment, then they can make it really, really difficult for people to actually sit and log on and do their work by, constantly throwing verbal abuse at them, perhaps being physical, demanding a lot off of people. And because of that as well, people, we've seen an explosion. It's a mental health crisis now, isn't it? So their own abilities, how they feel that they may be able to engage in work might suffer too. So being explicitly told or threatened not to work. So if you're told if you're not home by this time, then you'll pay for it. You're not going to work today. I know you can just log on to the laptop. I need you here to do this, this, and this for me. By saying your role as a mother, you shouldn't be working anyway. A lot of these abusers have this old kind of time mindset where women's place is in the home and they shouldn't be out engaging in employment. So that's definitely intensified as well, and that leads on to refusing to contribute to childcare. People who may have separated through the pandemic, their childcare arrangements are now really different, and the children's dads might be being quite difficult with that. I'm not a mother, but I can imagine how hard it is when you are a mother, trying to balance that kind of home life, work life responsibilities. And also as well, just the last point here, denying their access to the resources needed. So if someone's working from home, we've seen in some cases women's work laptops being hidden, their work phones being hidden, the internet being cut off, and even things like, if you're going into the office, having their car keys hidden, so they can't physically get in, and then they have to, phone up their employer and say, oh, I've lost my car keys, or come up with another excuse that kind of hides what's really going on. However, saying this, working from home has, for some, been incredibly helpful. The flexibility that's come with it during the pandemic has really helped women that may be struggling with childcare, maybe suffering kind of mentally and psychologically with their ability to work. Two, as well, if the abuser is still in the home, being able to kind of have that downtime, no pressure to work, and knowing that you can log on a bit later on is really, really helpful, and for a lot of women, probably life-saving. So we can go on to the next slide. So this again is an excerpt from a woman, and this is her experience of trying to work from home during lockdown and during COVID. So it says here, "He just made it impossible for me to work, really, really difficult, just disrupted me non-stop abuse, really absolutely unending, sort of verbal abuse or physical abuse as well. And he would also just, you know, demand that I look after him all the time and fly off the handle if I didn't." And a lot of women, you'll maybe hear from employees or other people that you know have experienced domestic abuse, will just say, well, I complied because life was easier. It was easier if I did. I just, I didn't want to cause a hassle. And that obviously has impacts on people's employment as well. So if we move on to the next slide, then I have a short case study here of Sarah, who we supported. And this case study really shows how lockdown affected people's relationships. And as I'm reading, if you think about how you as an employer could have helped Sarah or facilitated her and supported her, I suppose. So Sarah met John in the summer of lockdown in 2020. Things escalated extremely quickly, with John moving himself into Sarah's property. At first, Sarah believed that this was simply due to lockdown putting extra pressures on the relationship. However, it then became clear that this escalation was due to John's narcissistic tendencies and need for control. John quickly became aggressive whenever Sarah asked him to stay at his own property, accusing Sarah of constantly cheating on him. This paranoia was so extreme that in one incident, when Sarah was going to get a glass of water in the night, John accused her of having another person in the house whilst he was in their bedroom. John monitored her phone and would verbally abuse Sarah if her phone was on loud and he could hear the notifications. However, simultaneously, John would be annoyed if the phone was on silent, as then he could not tell who she was having contact with. John would pressure Sarah to have sex and would become angry if she refused. Sarah would often just comply in order to make life easier. At the point of contact with Shetland Women's Aid, Sarah was frightened of John and could not figure out how things happened so quickly. He now had a key to her flat, unknowing to her, and made her work from home incredibly difficult. He was returning whenever he pleased, and she did not know how to move on. Sarah told Shetland Women's Aid that it was impossible to get him to leave, and she did not know what was going to happen. So in that story, John actually got arrested by the police, and following this moved off island. So it's kind of a happy ending for Sarah. But this story kind of shows how lockdown had an impact on these relationships and made them really, really intense, really unhealthy, and how it kind of trickled into her employment and also just her other life. And Sarah is still, you know, dealing with the trauma of that. So we could move on to the next slide. So what role do you play as employers here? Domestic abuse is a hidden crime. However, it's all our responsibility to be aware of domestic abuse and know how to spot the signs. So some of the signs that someone may be in an abusive situation at home, especially as we move back into office working or hybrid working, is people's reluctance in returning to the office, kind of unexplained reluctance, or not wanting to expand on their reasons for it. Things such as unexplained injuries, consistent lateness, or changes in behaviour are all signs. Lynne spoke a little bit before about how abusers can kind of infiltrate into the office atmosphere, and I suppose with that is partners or ex-partners exerting an unusual amount of control or demands over the work schedule. So kind of non-stop phone calls, turning up unannounced, demanding that they finish early, that they go pick up the children, that they do, and here seeing the people on these phone calls maybe getting kind of harassed is definitely some concerning behaviour. As well, Lynne mentioned changes in productivity. So this includes, again, unexplained changes to people's work patterns, a reduced quality or quantity of work that you're used to, And again, changing the use of their phone and email, perhaps, constant checking the phone, phone calls, things like that. And on the flip side, you may see that employees are spending an increased amount of hours at work for no reason. They have this fear of going home, this, oh no, I'll just finish this off, I'll do this for you, anything to stay that extra 15 minutes later. And that's because they are scared of what awaits them when they come in that door. So that's kind of all the signs. And how, if we spot these, do we approach the topic? It's a really sensitive issue, you know, by asking someone, I'm concerned that you're experiencing domestic abuse, the likelihood of them saying, you know what, yeah, I actually am, is very, very slim. A lot of people don't realize that the situation they're in is abusive. So questions instead to ask would be, you know, what is life like for you? What are things like at home? I've noticed a change. Is everything okay? And it's really important, if you are going to ask these questions, to do so safely. Phones and phones and emails are probably going to be being monitored, and to phone someone up and ask these questions, you never know who's in the background, and that could actually be really dangerous. So if you wanted to speak to someone who was still kind of mostly working from home, ask for them to come into the office to have a quick chat, and then bring it up there. And that's probably the safest way. And moving on, talking about safety again, is that you can offer some practical support. So if a person is high risk, consider giving them a personal or workstation alarm, maybe a sign-in sheet at the start of the office desk, and having this name, if this person turns up, no, I'm sorry, you can't come in, and considering an alternative entrance and exit to and from the workplace. As well, it's really important to be flexible with someone, and that's something that Lynne just spoke about as well, and allowing someone to receive the appropriate support. So allowing them time to, you know, attend legal appointments, to attend this counselling if that's what they're having, to have prolonged periods of leave. And as well, flexibility, you know, if someone's fled from their home and is now living in a refuge in a different town, or has been placed, you know, been given a house through a council, but it's further away from the workplace, allowing someone to work from home, and being flexible to allow that move and the practicalities to take place. And the last point here is probably just the most important and pretty self-explanatory, is always prioritise someone's safety over their work efficiency. So I think that's me. Thank you for listening. And I now believe we will move on over to questions.
Thank you, Abby, for that really helpful and practical insight into the experience of survivors of domestic abuse and the impact that has had on their employment and their personal life. We're now going to take some time just at the end of the session today to answer some questions. And the first one I have is a question for Lynne. So the question is, what responsibilities do employers have if they're aware that children are present in the home during working hours?
Well, I suppose maybe one practical point is that, you know, maybe not so much during the actual pandemic itself when you had no choice, but people are not working from home to allow them to take care of children, I suppose, is an obvious point. So if there are children in the workplace, I'm not sure this is exactly where this question is coming from, but if there are children in the workplace, which is the home, then the employee should be ensuring that they are taken care of, so it doesn't impact on their working hours and what they're doing for work. If the question is coming more from the perspective, which I suspect it is given the context in which it's being asked, that there might be a concern over the safety of the children, and I suppose there's no particular legal obligation for the employer to do anything, but I suppose I don't know if there's any family law suggestions that you've got, Gary, but I mean, I suppose if anybody was concerned about children in the workplace and whether they might also be subjected to some sort of violence, then contacting the police or social services or something like that would seem to me to be an obvious thing to do. I mean, employers have always got to take care that they're not breaching their implied obligations towards employees of trust and confidence, but I think if you had reasonable grounds for holding a genuine concern that somebody who's not even your employee, but their children were at risk of some sort, then I think that would seem to me to be the obvious thing to do. I think, I'm not sure if that's really an employment law answer, but
well, thank you, Lynne.
Abby or Gary might have something to add to that.
No, from a family law perspective, I agree with what's said. I'm sure Abby will chip in as well, perhaps to explain that there is a lot of agency working and cross-agency working now when there are concerns for women, children and others who have experienced domestic abuse, particularly in relation to children. And there is a real emphasis now on all organisations and everyone involved in the lives of children to be aware of the potential for domestic abuse. And I think that would then flow from that, that if there is an awareness and understanding that a child is being exposed to or subjected to domestic abuse, there'd just be a general expectation that some concerns are raised. I think Lynne's point from an employment perspective is that there's no legal obligation, but I think this more crosses over into the moral obligations and how society expects there to be a protective system involved in our care system for children. I'm going to ask...
I was going to say that I could see how an employee might end up feeling aggrieved or raise a grievance if they feel that the employer stepped into something that they shouldn't be stepping into. But
it's difficult territory because there's the sort of protecting a child from a situation of harm against the employee's rights to confidentiality, and for that, and it's the crossover between those rights. It's quite finely balanced, and it is something where the employer is going to have to probably, Lynne, consider things pretty carefully as to their position and how they approach that subject. Lynne, there was another question that I had from you, and again, before we finish up, we've got a couple of minutes, but if anyone has any more questions, please do submit it using the Q&A function. The last question that I have just now, unless there's anything burning of the attendees, is about policies, Lynne, and how might employees be, if someone is a perpetrator of domestic abuse, how might an employer treat that situation and treat them?
So I suppose it might just be a general allegation that somebody is a perpetrator without there having been any legal interventions through criminal charges or anything like that. But if there has been an allegation that abuse has happened outside of the workplace, then it's still open to, but they're an employee, it's still open to the employer to consider whether or not that might engage their disciplinary procedures if the nature of the allegations is just such that the employer is concerned about that employee's ability to work with their employees in their particular workplace. I mean, I think something that's certainly very fact sensitive. So I think if that's a situation that somebody's got, then they probably want to take quite specific legal advice on it. But it certainly is a potential option for an employer to discipline somebody who is an accused perpetrator in some way of domestic violence, where that might have an impact on their ability to do their job.
Thanks, Lynne. It is clearly a big topic and something that you can't really go into in too much detail today, given our time constraints. And we have now reached the end of the time for the session today. I do hope that everyone has found today's session informative and useful. If there's anything arising from today's session that you wish to discuss, please feel free to contact either Lynne, Abby, or myself using the contact details that are on the slide here. We'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions. Again, thank you for everyone's attendance today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day today.